"Sir, this equipment is way too advanced for someone your age. Why don't you try the senior citizen snorkeling class instead?" Dylan Martinez, 28, smirked from behind the dive counter at Pacific Coast Scuba, gesturing dismissively at the gray-haired man examining a professional dive computer. The elderly customer wore simple khakis and a worn polo shirt, looking more like someone's grandfather than a serious diver. But in exactly 47 minutes, when maintenance worker Bobby Sullivan would become trapped 50 feet underwater in the shop's equipment testing tank with his air supply cut, and professional rescue divers calling it an impossible death trap, that out-of-place old man would execute the most dangerous improvised rescue in the shop's 30-year history and prove that some skills never rust. They only deepen with time. Before we dive into this story of underestimation, expertise, and a rescue that defied every safety protocol in the book, tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged by your appearance? And if you believe that experience trumps arrogance every time, hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you that true professionals don't need to prove themselves until lives are on the line. Pacific Coast Scuba sat at the end of Pier 47 in San Francisco Bay, its weathered windows displaying cutting-edge diving equipment that promised underwater adventures to those brave enough and skilled enough to pursue them. The shop's crown jewel was its 50-foot deep equipment testing tank, a massive cylinder built into the pier's foundation where advanced gear underwent rigorous trials before hitting the market. Frank Morrison had driven down from Sacramento that morning, seeking a specific piece of equipment for what he told himself would be his last serious diving expedition. At 68, he'd been feeling the weight of time more acutely lately, especially after his recent adventures at the resort pool and yacht club. Maybe it was time to hang up the fins for good. But first, one final dive to a site he'd discovered during his Navy SEAL days, a place that held memories both beautiful and haunting. The shop buzzed with the usual morning crowd, diving instructors prepping for tourist groups, serious sport divers discussing weekend plans, and equipment manufacturers running tests. Frank moved quietly through the aisles, his trained eye evaluating gear with the precision of someone who'd trusted his life to such equipment for decades. "Can I help you find something?" The voice carried just enough condescension to make Frank look up from the dive computer he'd been examining. Dylan Martinez stood behind him, clipboard in hand, his perfectly fitted wetsuit and instructor certification patches displayed like military decorations. At 28, Dylan had built Pacific Coast Scuba's reputation as one of the Bay Area's premier diving destinations. He was technically proficient, charismatic with customers, and absolutely convinced that diving was a young person's game. "I'm looking at this computer," Frank said quietly, holding up the device. Specifically the mixed gas capabilities and depth compensation algorithms. Dylan's eyebrows rose slightly. The unit Frank held was a $3,000 professional-grade computer designed for technical diving beyond recreational limits. "Sir, that's really more of a commercial diving tool. For someone just getting into the sport, we have much more user-friendly options over here." He gestured toward a display of basic recreational computers. "I'm not just getting into the sport," Frank replied evenly. "Of course not," Dylan said with a patronizing smile. "But diving technology has advanced significantly in recent years. What worked in the past might not meet current safety standards. How long has it been since your last dive?" Frank considered the question. His last official dive had been 6 months ago, helping a marine biology team recover research equipment from a 120-foot shipwreck. But he doubted Dylan would believe that. "Not long." Well, regardless, this particular computer requires advanced certification levels that frankly most recreational divers never achieve. Dylan took the device from Frank's hands with practiced authority. The mixed gas protocols alone require technical diving certification, rebreather training, and extensive deep water experience. It's really designed for professionals. Around them, other customers were beginning to notice the conversation. A group of young dive instructors had paused their equipment discussion to watch the interaction, several barely suppressing grins at what they assumed was an old man being gently redirected to his appropriate gear level. "Maybe you could tell me what kind of diving you're planning to do," Dylan continued, his tone now fully professional but unmistakably condescending. "We have excellent beginner packages, and our shallow water certification courses are very popular with the more mature crowd." Frank's weathered hands remained steady as he met Dylan's gaze. 40 years of military training had taught him to recognize dismissal when he saw it. More importantly, it had taught him when to respond and when to remain silent. This, he decided, was a time for silence. "I appreciate your concern," Frank said simply, "but I think I'll keep looking." Dylan shrugged, clearly writing off any potential sale. "Of course. Just remember that diving is ultimately about safety, and safety requires honest assessment of one's capabilities. Age brings wisdom, but it also brings limitations we need to respect." The words hung in the air like a challenge, though Dylan clearly didn't intend them as one. To him, Frank was simply another aging customer who needed guidance away from equipment beyond his abilities. The irony was lost on him entirely. Frank continued browsing, his presence now largely ignored by the shop staff, who had moved on to more promising customers. He examined regulators, tested buoyancy compensators, and evaluated cutting-edge underwater communication systems with the methodical precision of someone conducting a professional equipment review. It was 10:47 a.m. when the sound changed everything. The first indication was a rumbling from below the shop floor, followed by a muffled crash that sent vibrations through the entire building. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the rear of the shop where stairs led down to the testing tank facility. What the hell was that? Dylan dropped his clipboard and headed toward the tank access. The testing tank occupied a reinforced chamber beneath the shop, its 50-foot depth extending well below the pier's waterline. The facility was designed for equipment manufacturers to test gear under controlled conditions, simulating depths that recreational divers might never experience. On this particular morning, Bobby Sullivan, a 34-year-old maintenance technician from Aquatech Systems, had been conducting routine tests on a new underwater welding system. Dylan reached the tank chamber first, followed by several instructors and Frank, who had moved with surprising speed despite his age. What they found defied immediate comprehension. The tank's access platform, a steel structure that normally provided safe entry and exit, had partially collapsed. Twisted metal beams jutted at dangerous angles, and the electronic hoist system that lowered equipment into the tank hung at a precarious angle, its cables tangled and strained. But the real horror was 50 feet below, visible through the tank's thick glass viewing ports. Bobby Sullivan floated motionless near the tank's bottom, his body pinned beneath a piece of the fallen platform structure. His breathing apparatus had been damaged in the collapse, and bubbles rose in an irregular pattern that suggested his air supply was compromised. The underwater welding equipment he'd been testing was scattered around him, its electrical system sparking intermittently in the water. "Jesus Christ," Dylan breathed, fumbling for his radio. "Emergency response. This is Pacific Coast Scuba. We have a diving emergency in our testing tank. We need professional rescue divers immediately." Through the viewing port, they could see Bobby struggling weakly against the metal beam that trapped his legs. His eyes were open, aware, but his movements were growing less coordinated by the minute. The damaged breathing apparatus meant he was getting some air, but not enough, and not reliably. "How long can he survive down there?" asked Lisa Park, one of the shop's assistant instructors, her voice tight with panic. Dylan consulted his dive tables frantically. "With compromised air supply. At that depth, maybe 20 minutes if we're lucky. But the bigger problem is getting him out." The platform collapse blocked the normal access routes, and the tank's design makes emergency extraction almost impossible. Within minutes, the shop had transformed into a crisis command center. Emergency services had been contacted, but the nearest professional rescue diving team was 40 minutes away. Too long. The fire department's water rescue unit wasn't equipped for deep, confined space operations. Coast Guard divers were available, but mobilizing them would take over an hour. Every passing minute brought Bobby closer to disaster. Through the viewing port, they could see his struggles growing weaker. The irregular bubble pattern from his damaged regulator was becoming more erratic. "There has to be something we can do," Lisa said desperately. "We can't just watch him die down there." Dylan was already shaking his head. "Look at the situation." The platform collapse created a maze of twisted metal with sharp edges and electrical hazards. The access routes are blocked. Even if we had a volunteer rescue diver, the risk of creating a second victim is enormous. He pointed at the viewing port where the full scope of the problem was visible. The beam that's pinning him is wedged against the tank wall. Moving it would require precise positioning and probably underwater cutting equipment. Plus, his damaged breathing gear means any rescue attempt would have to be executed perfectly on the first try. There's no margin for error. What about the emergency lift system, someone suggested. Compromised in the collapse, Dylan replied grimly. The entire tank's emergency protocol depends on that platform system, and it's destroyed. Frank had remained silent throughout this exchange, studying the situation with the kind of systematic analysis that had kept him alive through countless dangerous operations. While others focused on the obvious obstacles, he was calculating possibilities, assessing equipment, and formulating solutions. What's the tank's entry protocol when the platform's operational? He asked quietly. Dylan looked at him with surprise, having almost forgotten the older man's presence. Standard procedure is lowering divers via the mechanical hoist system, but that's obviously not an option now. What about manual descent? Straight down the center? Theoretically possible, but incredibly dangerous without the platform's guidance system. Plus, there's no way to safely ascend with a victim. The tank wasn't designed for emergency extractions outside the normal protocol. Frank nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "What equipment do you have available for improvised rescue operations?" Dylan's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a situation for improvised anything. We're dealing with a confined space rescue at significant depth with electrical hazards and structural instability. This requires professional rescue divers with specialized equipment and training." "Professional rescue divers who won't arrive for 40 minutes, Frank replied evenly. "Exactly, which is why we wait for proper help rather than risk creating additional casualties." The exchange might have continued, but Bobby's condition was visibly deteriorating. His movements had become sluggish, and the bubble pattern from his regulator was now alarmingly irregular. Even Dylan could see that 40 minutes might be too long. Lisa Park voiced what everyone was thinking. He's not going to make it that long, is he? Dylan's professional facade cracked slightly. "I don't know. Maybe. We have to hope." Frank studied the viewing port once more, his mind working through the complex variables of the rescue. Depth, pressure, confined space, structural hazards, electrical dangers, time constraints, and available equipment. It was the kind of multi-factor problem that had defined his military career, the kind that had clear solutions if you could think beyond conventional approaches. "I need to examine your equipment inventory," he said. Dylan turned to stare at him. "What?" "Your equipment. What do you have available for deep water operations?" "Sir, I don't think you understand the severity of this situation. We're not dealing with a recreational diving problem. This is a technical rescue requiring someone who can think outside standard protocols." Frank interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several people look up. "Your professional rescuers aren't here. Your standard procedures have failed, and that man is going to die while we debate protocol." The directness of the statement silenced the room momentarily. Through the viewing port, Bobby's struggles were becoming increasingly weak. Dylan's face flushed with frustration. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't a movie. We can't just grab some scuba gear and improvise a rescue. The liability alone will be irrelevant if he's dead," Frank said simply. The truth of that statement hung in the air as everyone watched Bobby's increasingly desperate situation through the viewing port. His air supply was clearly failing, and his movements suggested he was fighting, not just the physical trap, but the onset of panic that would quickly consume what oxygen remained. Frank made his decision. "Show me your equipment," he said, this time with unmistakable command authority. Something in his tone made Dylan step back slightly. There was a quality to Frank's voice that suggested arguing might not be wise, a quiet certainty that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "The gear lockers are over there," Dylan said reluctantly, pointing toward a wall lined with equipment storage. Frank moved with purpose now, his earlier casual browsing replaced by systematic professional assessment. He examined regulators, tested buoyancy compensators, evaluated underwater cutting tools, and selected emergency ascent devices with the precision of someone who understood exactly what each piece of equipment could and couldn't do. "This regulator," he said, holding up a high-performance unit. "What's its performance rating at depth?" Dylan found himself answering automatically. "Rated for technical diving to 200 feet. Balanced first stage, environmentally sealed." "Good." This BC Frank indicated a buoyancy compensator, professional model, dual bladder system for redundancy. Frank continued his selection process, choosing items with the kind of systematic efficiency that gradually drew the attention of everyone in the shop. His choices weren't random. Each piece served a specific purpose in what was clearly a developing plan. "Sir," Dylan said, his voice carrying new uncertainty, "what exactly are you proposing?" Frank paused in his equipment selection and looked directly at Dylan for the first time since the crisis began. "I am proposing to save that man's life. But the risks are considerable," Frank agreed, "but manageable with proper technique and equipment. You can't possibly have the training for this kind of technical rescue." Frank's weathered hands continued assembling equipment with practiced precision. "Dylan, in my experience, the difference between possible and impossible usually comes down to whether someone's willing to accept the responsibility for trying." The younger man stared at him, something in Frank's demeanor beginning to penetrate his assumptions. "Who are you?" "Someone who's done this before." The simple statement carried implications that made several people exchange glances. Lisa Park stepped closer, studying Frank with new attention. "Done what before?" she asked. "Rescued people from situations where conventional approaches wouldn't work." Dylan's professional skepticism warred with the growing evidence that this wasn't an ordinary customer. Frank's equipment choices were too precise, his assessment too systematic, his confidence too unshakable. "Even if you have experience," Dylan said carefully, "this particular situation is unprecedented. The confined space, the structural hazards, the electrical dangers. Make it complex, not impossible," Frank corrected, "but we're losing time for debate." Through the viewing port, Bobby's condition was clearly critical. His movements had become minimal, and the bubble pattern from his regulator was now sporadic at best. Frank finished his equipment assembly and turned to face the group. What they saw was no longer an out-of-place elderly customer, but someone who radiated competence and authority. His posture had shifted, his movements had gained precision, and his eyes held the kind of calm focus that came from extensive experience with dangerous situations. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "I'm going down to extract Bobby Sullivan. Dylan, you're going to coordinate surface support and emergency medical preparation. Lisa, you're going to monitor communications and keep emergency services updated on our status." "Wait," Dylan said, his voice rising. "You can't just—" "Can't what?" Frank asked quietly. "You can't take that kind of risk. The liability issues alone would destroy this business. And if something goes wrong, if you get trapped down there too, then we have 2 victims instead of 1. Frank paused in his final equipment check. "Dylan, what do you think Bobby's family would prefer? That we followed liability protocols while he died, or that someone took the risk to try saving him?" The question hung in the air as everyone processed its implications. Through the viewing port, Bobby's struggles had become barely perceptible. "Besides," Frank added with the hint of a smile, "I won't get trapped." "How can you possibly be so confident?" "Because I've been in worse situations and made it out." Dylan stared at him, clearly struggling with the decision. Professional caution warred with the growing realization that conventional rescue wasn't coming in time. Around them, the shop staff watched the debate while Bobby's life ebbed away 50 feet below. "What kind of worse situations?" Lisa asked quietly. Frank paused in adjusting his regulator, the kind where failure meant more than 1 life lost. The cryptic answer only deepened the mystery, but there was no time for further explanation. Through the viewing port, Bobby had stopped moving entirely, though bubbles still rose intermittently from his damaged breathing apparatus. Dylan made his decision. "If you're going to do this, we do it right. Full emergency protocol, constant communication, and abort at the first sign of trouble." Frank nodded. "Agreed, but understand, once I'm committed to the descent, aborting may not be an option." "Why not?" "Because Bobby's air supply is failing. This is a one-shot opportunity." The weight of that statement settled over everyone as Frank completed his final preparations. He suited up with movements that demonstrated decades of experience, every action precise and purposeful. His equipment checks followed protocols that impressed even Dylan with their thoroughness. "Communication system?" Dylan asked, falling into the role of dive coordinator despite his reservations. "Standard underwater radio," Frank replied, testing the system. "But understand that once I reach Bobby, I may not be able to maintain contact." "Emergency ascent plan?" "Depends on Bobby's condition and the structural situation down there. May need to improvise based on what I find." Dylan realized he was now fully committed to supporting what could either be an heroic rescue or a disaster that would haunt him forever. But watching Bobby's motionless form through the viewing port, he knew that doing nothing was also a choice with consequences. Frank stood at the edge of the tank, fully equipped and ready. In his diving gear, his age became less apparent, but his competence became unmistakable. Every aspect of his preparation demonstrated experience that couldn't be faked. "Last chance to change your mind," Dylan said. Frank looked down into the dark water 50 feet below, where Bobby Sullivan waited between life and death. "I stopped changing my mind about rescues a long time ago." He stepped forward and dropped into the tank. The descent was controlled and precise, Frank's buoyancy management demonstrating skills that made Dylan and the watching staff exchange glances. This wasn't recreational diving. It was technical precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. At 30 feet, Frank paused to assess the situation below. The collapsed platform had created a maze of twisted metal beams and electrical hazards that would have challenged any professional rescue team. Sparks from damaged welding equipment continued to arc through the water, creating additional dangers. But Frank had faced similar chaos before, in places where mistakes meant not just personal failure, but strategic disaster. His mind automatically began mapping safe approaches, identifying structural weak points, and calculating the sequence of actions needed to free Bobby without triggering further collapse. At 40 feet, he could see Bobby clearly through the maze of debris. The maintenance worker was conscious but barely responsive, his breathing apparatus functioning intermittently. The metal beam pinning his legs was wedged against the tank wall in a way that would require precise maneuvering to remove. Frank reached Bobby at the 50-foot bottom and immediately began his assessment. The man's air supply was indeed compromised. His regulator was damaged but still delivering some oxygen. However, the irregular flow meant Bobby was getting insufficient air and would likely lose consciousness within minutes. The rescue would require 3 critical steps: stabilizing Bobby's breathing, freeing him from the debris, and executing an emergency ascent while managing both their air supplies and avoiding the electrical hazards. Frank began with Bobby's immediate needs, providing his backup regulator to establish reliable airflow. Bobby's eyes focused slightly as clean oxygen reached his lungs, but he remained too weak to assist with his own rescue. The metal beam required careful manipulation. Frank used his diving knife to clear smaller debris, then positioned himself to leverage the beam away from Bobby's trapped legs. The work was made dangerous by the sparking electrical equipment and the instability of the collapsed platform above them. Through the viewing port 50 feet above, Dylan and the staff watched in fascination and terror as Frank worked with systematic precision in conditions that would have challenged any professional rescue team. His movements were economical and purposeful, demonstrating experience with technical rescue operations that seemed impossible for someone his age. The beam shifted slightly as Frank applied leverage, but moving it completely would require a combination of strength, technique, and timing that seemed impossible in the confined space with the electrical hazards crackling around them. Frank paused in his work, studying the problem with the kind of systematic analysis that had kept him alive through countless dangerous operations. The solution, when it came to him, was elegantly simple and terrifyingly risky. He began repositioning the damaged welding equipment, not to remove the electrical hazard, but to use it. By carefully directing the electrical arc, he could cut through the beam at its weakest point rather than trying to move it bodily. The technique required precise control in 50 feet of water while managing 2 air supplies and avoiding electrocution. It was the kind of improvised solution that would either save both their lives or kill them both. Dylan watched from above as Frank began the cutting operation, his movements demonstrating familiarity with underwater welding that suggested extensive training. Sparks flew through the water in controlled patterns as Frank carefully severed the beam at its stress point. The cutting took 3 agonizing minutes, during which Bobby's condition continued to deteriorate, and Frank worked with the kind of focused precision that made everyone watching hold their breath. When the beam finally separated, freeing Bobby's legs, Frank immediately began the ascent preparation. Bobby was semi-conscious and unable to assist, which meant Frank would need to control both their buoyancy and air supplies during the 50-foot emergency ascent. The ascent was a masterclass in technical diving. Frank managed their combined buoyancy with micro-adjustments that prevented rapid ascent while ensuring they cleared the debris field above them. He shared his air supply with Bobby while monitoring both their conditions and watching for signs of decompression problems. At 30 feet, Frank paused for a safety stop despite the emergency conditions, demonstrating the kind of professional discipline that prioritized long-term safety over dramatic rescue theater. At 20 feet, Bobby began to regain consciousness as steady oxygen flow and decreasing pressure improved his condition. At 10 feet, Frank could see the faces pressed against the viewing port above. Dylan, Lisa, and the shop staff, who had watched the entire operation with growing amazement. They broke the surface to cheers and immediate medical attention as EMTs who had arrived during the rescue took charge of Bobby's care. But the real reaction came as Frank removed his diving gear and stood on the tank's edge, once again appearing as the quiet, elderly man who had walked into the shop that morning. Dylan stared at him with something approaching awe. "Who are you?" Frank toweled off his gray hair and adjusted his polo shirt. "Frank Morrison." "But who are you really? That wasn't recreational diving. That was technical rescue work that most professional teams couldn't have executed." Frank paused in gathering his equipment. Around them, the shop staff waited for an answer that would explain what they had just witnessed. "I'm retired Navy," he said simply. "Navy what?" Lisa asked. "SEAL." The simple statement hit the room like a physical force. Suddenly, Frank's age became irrelevant, his quiet demeanor took on new meaning, and Dylan's earlier dismissiveness became a professional embarrassment of epic proportions. "Navy SEAL," Dylan repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Retired," Frank corrected, "for a long time. But the technical rescue skills, the underwater welding, the emergency medical training, you learn a lot of things in 30 years of service," Frank said mildly. Bobby Sullivan, now stable and breathing normally, managed to focus on Frank's face. "You saved my life." "You saved your own by staying calm down there," Frank replied. "Panic would have made rescue impossible." Dylan was still processing the revelation. "You let me lecture you about diving safety, about age limitations, about equipment requirements." Frank smiled slightly. "You were doing your job. Protecting customers from equipment beyond their abilities is good practice. But you weren't a customer beyond his abilities. You were probably more qualified than any of us." "Experience is different from qualification," Frank said. "Your certifications and training are valuable, but some situations require thinking beyond the textbook." Lisa Park, who had coordinated surface support during the rescue, stepped forward. "How many rescues like that have you done?" Frank considered the question. "In 30 years, more than I'd like to remember, but fewer than the number of times good equipment and proper training prevented the need for rescues." The implications of his answer suggested decades of experience with dangerous operations that most people couldn't imagine, the kind of background that made a 50-foot technical rescue in a collapsed tank seem routine rather than impossible. Dylan looked around his shop, seeing it differently now. The equipment Frank had selected, the techniques he'd employed, the systematic approach to an unprecedented emergency, all of it demonstrated expertise that humbled everyone present. "The dive computer you were looking at this morning," Dylan said slowly. "You really did need the technical specifications." "I'm planning one final dive," Frank confirmed. "Somewhere special. Somewhere that requires mixed gas protocols and deep water navigation. Anywhere we can help you prepare for it," Frank smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "Actually, yes. I was hoping to find someone who understood that age and experience aren't the same thing as limitations." Dylan extended his hand. "Frank Morrison, it would be an honor to help you prepare for whatever dive you're planning. And if you ever need equipment tested, or if you'd consider sharing some of your experience with our technical diving students." Frank shook the offered hand. "I'll think about it." As EMTs wheeled Bobby Sullivan out on a stretcher, conscious, stable, and repeatedly thanking the quiet man who had risked his life for a stranger, the shop slowly returned to normal activity. But something had changed in the atmosphere, a new respect for the understanding that expertise comes in unexpected packages. Frank completed his equipment purchase, finally acquiring the technical dive computer he'd originally sought. Dylan insisted on providing it at cost, along with several other items Frank hadn't requested, but Dylan thought might be useful for his planned dive. "Where are you planning this final dive?" Lisa asked, as Frank prepared to leave. Frank looked out of the shop's windows toward the Pacific Ocean, his eyes focusing on something beyond the horizon. "Somewhere I should have visited years ago. Somewhere that holds memories I need to face." The cryptic answer suggested depths of personal history that went beyond professional accomplishment, but no one felt comfortable pressing for details. As Frank walked toward the shop's exit, carrying his new equipment and wearing the same simple clothes he'd arrived in, Dylan called after him. "Frank, thank you, not just for saving Bobby, but for teaching us something about assumptions." Frank paused at the door. "Dylan, you're a good instructor with excellent technical skills. Don't let today make you doubt your judgment about customer safety. Just remember that sometimes the most experienced people are the ones who feel least need to prove it." He walked out into the San Francisco morning, leaving behind a shop full of diving professionals who would never again assume that age-determined ability or that quiet confidence might not conceal extraordinary competence. Bobby Sullivan recovered completely and returned to work within a week, though he never again performed equipment testing without additional safety protocols. He kept Frank's business card in his wallet and sent him Christmas cards for years afterward. Dylan Martinez implemented new emergency protocols based on what he'd learned from Frank's rescue techniques, and his shop became known throughout the Bay Area for its innovative approach to technical rescue training. And Frank Morrison, he completed his final dive 3 weeks later, visiting an underwater memorial site in the Pacific where he'd lost teammates decades earlier. It was a journey that brought peace to memories he'd carried too long, and a fitting end to a diving career that had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. But that's another story for another day. The important lesson from that morning at Pacific Coast Scuba was simpler and more universal: that heroes don't always announce themselves, that experience often wears humble clothes, and that the difference between possible and impossible sometimes comes down to whether someone has the courage to try. Because at 50 feet underwater, with electrical hazards sparking and a man's life hanging in the balance, age becomes irrelevant, assumptions become dangerous, and the only thing that matters is whether you have the skills, the courage, and the commitment to do what needs to be done. Frank Morrison had all three, and Bobby Sullivan went home to his family because of it.